So by that, I have informed you about today's activities, and you who participated in the conference 2009, I think it was, the first conference. Remember, we had a visitor from Cleveland Clinic presenting their work with electronic medical records and using them for clinical research. And I think it's exciting now that we have Anil Jain with us. And Anil will tell you a lot more and a bit more about Anil and his background. But now you moved from Cleveland Clinic, where you spent, is it 16 years? Now being the Chief Information Officer at Explorers. So please help me welcome Dr. Anil Jain.
Thank you, and good morning. Thank you, Kai. So what I'm going to do is basically give you a quick overview of what it is that we do at Explorers. But before I do that, a little bit of my background. So as Kai mentioned, I was at the Cleveland Clinic for 16 years. I initially trained as a biomedical engineer at Northwestern in Chicago, and immediately saw the value of technology in the clinical space. Went to medical school, and then I was in a very lucky spot at the Cleveland Clinic when I was doing my training. At the Cleveland Clinic, back in 97, 96, 97 timeframe, they were in the process of choosing an electronic medical record. And during my training, I got involved in that selection process. And then shortly after, I saw the value of having electronic medical records and doing some secondary things with it, such as clinical research and quality outcomes. Now, what I will do this morning is to give you a brief overview of what Explorers is, but more importantly, talk a little bit about this buzzword, big data. If you do any Google searches around databases, and especially around clinical research and making more use of the data that we all have, you will see vendors pitching this idea of big data. And I'll explain to you a little bit about what big data means to us at Explorers. In order for me to do that, and in order for me to tell you a little bit more about what we do, I want to go over the U.S. healthcare system very, very briefly. We don't have a lot of time to actually talk about the U.S. healthcare system, and we all know that's really not a system. It's more of a mishmash of different things that are going on over there. Talk a little bit about health information technology and what it means to us, and then talk about how we're using tools to help the research community. If we have time and if we maintain a good internet connection, I'll demo our software to you so you can see live some of the uses of how we use the Explorers tool for clinical research. And then talk a little bit about the direction that Explorers is taking that's going to be of a significant value to everyone in the room as we start to get beyond just looking at EMR data and start getting into outcomes and patient-reported information from home, and start thinking about what it means when there's a confluence of technology to help lower the cost of healthcare in the U.S. and the data that gets generated that we can all use. And then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for some Q&A at the end. So what Explorers essentially is, and when someone asks me to explain what I do in an elevator ride that's less than 16 stories, is I say that it's a big data analytics company that's focused on healthcare. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to take all that information that comes in big data, I'll explain what big data means in a second, and drive net new knowledge. Make someone discover something that they could not discover if they did not take advantage of the big data platform. And then also, at the same time, to use that same data that's being aggregated from various sources and to start measuring outcomes and start measuring the quality of care that's being delivered. Now, as Kai mentioned, I was at the Cleveland Clinic for 16 years. But back in 2008, we had this idea that if we wanted to do the work that we were doing at the Cleveland Clinic, some of the work that you guys may have heard about when Martin Harris was here several years ago, of using the EMR to support clinical research, if we wanted to scale that up and make that available to other organizations, we needed to go beyond the walls of the Cleveland Clinic. And we were fortunate that the Cleveland Clinic had a technology transfer arm called Cleveland Clinic Innovations that helped us form a spin-off venture back in 2009. And so what we're going to be talking about today is really a Cleveland Clinic spin-off that's giving value to a lot of healthcare organizations outside of the Cleveland Clinic. Not just healthcare providers, but also life science partners in the U.S. Right now, our network includes more than 75 hospitals and 13 million lives in the system. Now, that's not just administrative data, that's clinical data. That's vital signs plus diagnoses plus medication prescriptions, etc. Now, we won a number of awards in the US. Gartner is a analytics research firm, and they've given us a 2011 Cool Vendor Award. And we love to get Cool Vendor Awards, but basically they gave it to us for was a disruptive, sustainable solution that was really needed in the US. And we also got the Startup of the Year from MedCity News, a healthcare newspaper in the US. Now, so let me go back now. So if Explorers was founded in 2009, and we started thinking about spinning it off in 2008, what happened before that? So we implemented the electronic medical record at the Cleveland Clinic in probably 1999. We started our first pilot group. I was actually one of the few first pilot users. And then approximately 2001, we got the brilliant idea of, rather than having people running around reading charts and reviewing charts, we could actually pluck the data out of the database. And then shortly after that, we decided if we can do it for clinical care, we can certainly do that for research. So in 2003, we formed a group that you probably have heard about in the past from Dr. Martin Harris called eResearch. I directed that group since 2003, and our sole task was to get the research community at the Cleveland Clinic and the external folks, the sponsors who come in to do trials, the tools they needed from our EMR to facilitate clinical research. And we supported hundreds of abstracts in the process, and we've had more than 60 clinical trials in which we helped patients get recruited through our identification tools. Dozens of manuscripts, some of which you may have read in the years. And again, we spun out Explorers in 2009. So what is big data? I mentioned that word a few times now. So there are really 5 V's that describe big data. And it's not just volume. We all know that if it's a large amount of data, then we can call it big data. But it's not just about the volume of data. It's about the velocity. How fast is it coming at us? And then the variety. Is it all just structured numbers and names, or is it imaging? Is it genomics? What is the variety of the information? And then the variability. When you start talking about incorporating data from 80 hospitals, we don't have that luxury of assuming that all 80 hospitals are collecting data the exact same manner. So we have to think about the variability of it. And then, of course, the only reason to bring something into a database is if there's some value to somebody, either today or tomorrow. Now, just don't take our word for it. We know that from market analyses in the past, and this is a McKinsey report that shows that the value proposition for big data in terms of which industries have yet to leverage it, healthcare sits in a sweet spot. This is the time for us to be thinking about big data from healthcare life science point of view, because if we're not, we're losing a huge opportunity. There was one study that was done that said, at least in the US, that we could save $300 million by the use of big data in healthcare. And it's just what it basically means to me is that there are people running around today with silos of data that are not incorporating them into something that's going to give us some more meaningful information. Well, there's also some other stuff that are going on now. In my background, I'm also a health IT nut, in a sense that I follow what's happening with the health IT debate in the U.S. like crazy. I'm on a few committees at the federal level. I'm involved with the Institute of Medicine around their electronic health record user collaborative, trying to get value from it. And 3 wonderful things are happening right now in the U.S. that are driving a perfect storm for the use of big data that's going to benefit everyone in the room. The first one is, and you guys obviously are, if you're watching the news, you're watching the fact that we're having a primary election right now for our president. And one of the biggest things that is being debated is the Affordable Care Act. This is the healthcare reform bill that's going on right now. And one of the basic tenets in there is that it's causing a shift in the U.S., which has traditionally been a fee-for-service. The more I do as a clinician, I'm a general internist by training, the more I do as a clinician, the more money I get paid. It doesn't matter as much about the outcomes of the patient, but what I actually perform. I order a blood test on the patient, I get paid. Order an x-ray, I get paid, etc. What the Affordable Care Act says is, well, hang on a second. That's all and good, and we now need to transform from a fee-for-service-based healthcare system in the U.S. to a value-based one. I should get paid for the outcomes my patients achieve, which means we need to be tracking those outcomes, both the baseline characteristics and what ends up happening with the patients, which is a great thing for me because that's all data that I can then use for the work that we do. High tech is another bill. This is a bill that was introduced in February of 2009. This was part of the American stimulus bill that was trying to get people back to work and get money into the economy. And what high tech did was it said, look, we know that we need to get electronic medical records into the hands of U.S. physicians. we also know that they're not going to do that by themselves. They're not going to go out and purchase something that costs $50,000 a year unless we help them. So the federal government gave money for providers and hospitals to go out and get EMRs. Well, the EMRs are obviously a great source of data, and we'll talk about how good that source of data is, but it's data that we can then use. It also provided money to connect hospitals with providers and providers with hospitals so that you have this continuity of care that we did not see in the US for a long time. Now, the third thing that's happened is that there's been a huge influx of smart devices, whether it's the smart bed that's sending telemetry data about the pressure of each part of the body, or the smart IV pump, or the new pacemaker that has new telemetry data, etc. You're all familiar with this. There's a huge number of new devices out there that's sending data, and there's new diagnostic equipment that's sending data. We need to be able to assimilate that data and make it useful. Going back to the U.S. healthcare system, I think most folks in the room understand that it's very different than most of the European countries, in the fact that physicians are in most of the physicians are in private solo practices. They don't have a huge incentive to connect themselves with the hospitals. There's medical groups like the Cleveland Clinic that also happen to own a hospital, but majority of the physicians are in private practice. In addition, most of the clinics are for profit, which is very different than obviously in the European countries. The hospitals, there's usually three flavors of them. There's the private, nonprofit, and then there's the state-run ones. The safety net, when folks don't have insurance in the U.S., where do they go? They go to a safety net hospitals. And all these different systems have different medical record systems. So in the U.S., there's probably about 126 different major electronic health record vendors. Now, there's probably only about 10 or 15 major players, but that's a huge number of systems that need to be integrated. Now, I think I don't need to be telling this group about this kind of data here, but it's pretty obvious that for the money that the United States spends on healthcare, we don't necessarily get our value. We just continue to spend more money without seeing a significant impact on quality, or a significant impact on longevity, or on infant mortality, or any of the other things that we would consider to be markers of quality of healthcare. Now, back in 2001, this is shortly after I started getting into the electronic medical records at the Cleveland Clinic, there was a report done by the Institute of Medicine that showed that we were doing a terrible job in the U.S. at managing the patient's risk when they're in the hospital. Nearly 100,000 patients were dying in the hospital due to things that we could prevent. These are things like giving the patient the wrong medication, or in some cases, not interviewing the patient for getting their allergies and giving them a medication that they're allergic to. There's a significant financial impact of that, but the bottom line was that the Institute of Medicine felt, and the authors all were unanimous on this, is that it really wasn't a system. It was a fragmented series of events that patients went through. That was the U.S. healthcare system, if you will. And it was complex, and it was inefficient, and there was a lot of waste. And they recommended a fundamental redesign. That was in 2001. So what's happened? 2011. Commonwealth Fund recently wrote a report that says that U.S. ranks last out of 19 countries. It's incredible that no significant progress has been made in those 10 years. But if you look at our politics that we have in the U.S., there's no, you're not too surprised about that. We didn't do a whole lot. We still have about 100,000 deaths in U.S. hospitals due to preventable disease or preventable errors that are made by clinicians and by their support staff. And we spend a significant amount in healthcare. So nothing really has changed. Now, and I'm not going to go through all this, but there's not a single place where I could find that we have any significant progress when it comes to healthcare. And most of them have to do with preventable things. So what does that mean? What was the bottom line of all this? The bottom line was that we needed a new way of looking at things, and that's where the Affordable Care Act came into play. So this is the healthcare reform bill that you've been hearing about, and there were really four things in it. Insurance reform. Remember that most patients in the U.S. have insurance through their employers. They're not through the public or the government. 2/3 of them have them as private insurance. Only about 1/3 are on Medicare, which is our public insurance for folks that are over 65. They also don't cover everything. So things that are preventable conditions, they in some cases won't cover. Pre-existing conditions they generally didn't cover until the Affordable Care Act was passed. And we already talked about the healthcare delivery system is completely fragmented. And you get paid to do more, not to do better. So these are the four key strategies of the healthcare reform bill. We also know that if you change the way that people get paid, this is an example from the US where if you put in an electronic medical record, or you do something around putting a medical home in where every patient knows who their primary care physician is, or you start to get nurses to work alongside physicians to manage some less complex cases. All those different things, when you look at them, the biggest impact that's made is really around bundling the payments. And very simply, all that means is rather than paying for everything that happens, let's say during a knee replacement with a new artificial joint, we're going to pay you from the moment that the primary care physician diagnoses you with osteoarthritis all the way until you finish your rehabilitation. We're going to pay the physician and the hospital a single payment. That has the biggest impact on healthcare costs. But in order to get to a bundled payment system in the US, we're missing a lot of data. We need to understand, how do you define the beginning? How do you define the end? How do you connect the physician with the hospital, with the physical therapist, with the rehab facility? So all this requires a bunch of data being brought together. Now, this is a humbling slide for me, because back in 2001, I would have never predicted that we would have been going this slow with the electronic medical records. But as you can see up here, that the United States, from 2000 to 2009, has not made a huge impact. I mean, we've doubled the number of electronic medical record users, or these patient journals, as you guys call them. But look at the countries that you're familiar with. Look at this. Sweden, 94%. Now, granted, you guys have some issues about connecting hospitals and providers, but still, the electronic medical record adoption in other countries is significantly ahead of the United States. Yet the United States has been trying to do this. So the fact that they're now paying physicians to use electronic medical records hopefully is going to make a big difference. And what they've done is they've created something called Meaningful Use Program. So what this program does is it says to a provider in a hospital, if you go out and buy an electronic medical record, we will subsidize the cost, $44,000 over the period of 5 years. But you have to be a meaningful user. You can't just get the electronic medical record, plug it in, use it, and hope that you're going to get a check from the federal government. You got to prove to us that you're using it in a meaningful way, that you are actually capturing important data, and this is going to come right back to us from a life science point of view, because it all starts with the physicians in the office. If they're not capturing it, it's not there. So meaningful use is going to require physicians to capture important data that's important to all of us. It's also going to require that the data be shared between the provider and the hospitals. And then it goes through a series of stages. So by the time 2015 comes around, it's going to require that the physicians demonstrate improved outcomes. And in order for this to happen, each physician is going to get paid some money to do so. I'm not going to go through all these regulations, but these are all the objectives that need to be met. And there's an article that's in the Annals of Internal Medicine that describes this in significant detail. But the bottom line is, it's not just to get the technologies to be meaningful users. And that's going to benefit all of us, because it's going to capture the right kind of data we need to drive the baseline characteristics and the outcomes that we need to be able to measure whenever we look for patients in a clinical trial, or we start thinking about patients and how they actually feel when we prescribe certain medications or give them certain devices. I'm not going to go through all this, but again, in the United States right now, the requirements for using an electronic medical record is you can't just plug it in. So physicians have to put the orders in the system. They have to prescribe all their medications through the electronic medical record, and then we measure that. And only if you meet a certain threshold do you get the check from the federal government. Now, we talked a little bit about whether the program is working or not. This is recent data. I think this is from September. The numbers have not significantly changed when I looked at this a week ago. But approximately only about a fifth of doctors who are eligible to get this money have applied for it. And if you think about applying for the money and then actually getting the money, it's two different things. So when you're looking at how many actually have achieved this, it's only about 3,800 physicians. So it's not going very well so far, but there's still a lot of work being done to see whether we can accelerate this. And Martin Harris, who you guys may have met a couple years ago, is one of the key people on the committees that are fostering this. We talked about smart devices. I'm not going to go through all this, but the other area that we ought to be thinking about is genomics and personalized medicine. Recent article that suggested that now they have a device, a sequencer, that will cost an average of just $1,000 and perform a genome assay on a patient in 24 hours. I think that's completely phenomenal. It's just going to change the way we think about using patients' genomic data and personalized medicine. Where are you going to put all that information? It's certainly not going to go in the electronic medical record, or will it? And if it does, how does the clinician have to, how are they able to pour through all that information that's being generated to make the right decision for the right patient? Our feeling is, our bet at Explorus is that you're going to need big data. This data is going to go into a big data store, and it's going to churn and give, and it's going to spit out the most important things that's going to make their way to the clinicians. This is a nice quote from Eric Schmidt of Google. He said that every 2 days we create more information, or as much information rather, as we did from the dawn of civilization up until 2003. That's pretty incredible. And so, again, unless we all want to have huge data centers at each of our hospitals, and we want to have data centers that are going to exponentially grow, and think about the economic and environmental footprint those data centers have, the heating and the electricity and the cooling. So our bet is that we're going to need to have a cloud-based solution where not everyone is going to have a data center, but there'll be a data center and we'll be renting space or renting storage or renting computing power from those data centers. Because otherwise, how are you going to deal with this phenomena? And in healthcare, it's just, every time you do an MRI or a CAT scan, that's a huge amount of data that not every place needs to store. So big data for healthcare and life science for me means that we can unlock significant value by making the information transparent and usable. We can focus on the data used to conduct research rather than managing and securing data. Again, do you want to be a healthcare organization that happens to deliver healthcare but is really a IT organization? Or do you want to be a healthcare organization and then outsource your IT to those who are experts? And from a life science point of view, those of you in life science, how many of you guys have silos of data that are sitting there that you don't feel like you're getting complete value from? A handful of people. I suspect it's more than a handful of people. I hear this argument all the time. Can you help us connect data, disparate data together? Because we have these pockets of data that we just don't know how to use. And now, more important for us is how do you narrow that segmentation of the patients that we're interested in targeting when you start having all this holistic data that you can incorporate. And I'll show you a couple of examples of that. And then, of course, the area that our company is now focused on is analytics. How do you provide the solutions that we need and the analyses that we need as life science, as healthcare organizations that are powered by big data, not just by small data sets? Do you have the power in a small data set to make a difference and to measure a difference that you can in a big data set? Just to prove to you that this is not just life science and healthcare providers dealing with big data, two mainstream journals and one life science, or if you will, a healthcare life science journal, they all talk about big data and how data is power, and we obviously believe that. And it's something which is we're going to hear more and more of. And as vendors start catching up to supporting big data, because one of the things I haven't mentioned, and I'll show you in a little bit, traditional databases can't handle big data. So it's a paradigm shift in how we support it from a IT point of view. So what's our approach? So the way that we do it is we think about all the different venues in which data is being generated from a healthcare point of view. And from a life science point of view, you care, because if something's happening at any one of these places, you need to know about it. And of course, you also need to know about if it's happening at the patient's home, whether it's happening with home healthcare or it's a patient's diary that they're managing their symptoms. You need to know and have that information be driven up into a cloud. You can't see that cloud that well, but that's really supposed to be a cloud over here. Now, right now, we have, as I mentioned, 13 million patients. Those 13 million patients have 41 billion facts, clinical facts, operational facts, financial facts about them that are available for us to be able to harness. And what we do is we have created 3 applications. Explorer, which is probably the one that's most relevant for this group, which lets us do ad hoc searches across those populations of patients, create cohorts, look at their providers, look at the care venues, and do so in an interactive way so that we're not calling up our analyst and saying, by next week, can you give me this report? And then when you see the report, say, look, I have another idea. Let me go back and get yet another report and another report. And then maybe in 6 weeks to 12 weeks, you got something. We're talking about doing it in seconds to have a dialogue and interaction. I'll show you this. Our next module is measure, where we try to take some of the outcomes that we're all interested in, whether it's life science who want to make sure that the providers that they recruit for clinical trials are doing best-in-breed care, or it's hospital organizations that if they give us this data, what are they expecting from us in return? They're expecting us to be able to measure and monitor how well they're taking care of their patients. And then the final piece is engage. Whereas life science can engage with our patients to help them get into a clinical trial, providers want to engage with those patients because they want to make sure they reach out to patients who are missing certain care opportunities. Women who have not gotten their mammograms, men and women who have not gotten their colon cancer screening tests, etc. How do we do it? So for some of the more technically savvy folks in the room, we don't use Oracle, we don't use Microsoft, we don't use IBM, we don't use a relational database. What we do is we have a cloud. In the last count, we had something like 440 processors on servers sitting in a data center. And in this data center, there's more than 100 terabytes of data storage space. And we take the data that's coming from each organization is represented up here. And we place a little appliance behind their firewall. And all this appliance does, and it's a highly secure appliance. We have a strong presence, our sister companies, in cybersecurity. And what this does is it takes this data, de-identifies it, keeps an encrypted key behind the firewall, and sends up a whole bunch of de-identified, anonymized data to the grid. But in the process of doing so, we curate and standardize and harmonize all the data so that whether it's coming from Washington, D.C., or Cleveland, or Los Angeles, chest pain in all three organizations means the same thing when it gets to the Explorer system. Or a serum creatinine has the same identifier. And we talked about the applications that we build. We're also looking for third-party applications. Our partners might want to build something on top of our platform. And then we can also materialize the traditional database on demand as needed for any specialized purpose. For example, we were involved with the OMOP initiative in the US where we needed to materialize a relational database so we can apply some of the patient safety and surveillance tools right on top of it using SAS. We can do that, not a big deal. But our core strength is in our big data architecture, which is based on a column store rather than a relational database. And then we have these high-performance indices that are proprietary. We all know that the electronic health record and the personal health record generate a huge bunch of information. And what's happening now is that we're getting a lot of quality of life tools, patient-reported outcomes that are being built right into the EMR and right into the PHR. So that I can have a patient the day before he comes to see me in my office with knee pain, and I can ask them an SF12 or an SF36 to find out how they're feeling. All that data is coming into the healthcare organization's database, and we're pulling it out of there, standardizing it, and putting it into our database. Now, what's the problem with the traditional approach? Hopefully you guys can't see all these tables in this database. This is a real EMR, and this is just the ambulatory EMR to figure out, this is from Epic, one of the most famous, popular EMRs in the US, just to figure out what's happening in the ambulatory setting around diagnoses and vital signs and things like that. Well, this is crazy. You need specialized people to figure out how to manage all this. And moreover, as the vendor changes their style, everything gets modified. So what do we do instead? Well, we take all that information, and we've mapped all the major EMRs. We take diagnoses, procedures, drugs, observations, devices, and other things, and we map it from whatever is in the EMR to a standard ontology. So SNOMED for diagnoses, CPT HCPCS codes, we map them to SNOMED procedures. Drugs, we map them to RX norm and SNOMED. Observations go to something called LOINC, which is a very much a standard in the US. And so on. For devices, the FDA in the US did not have a device map. So we created one and gave it back to the FDA to help them with mapping their devices. Now, this is a question I get all the time. Well, how good is the data that's coming from these healthcare providers? If it's being fed by providers like myself, when we're seeing patients and we're busy, how good is it? Well, you know, just like we tell the computer that they can't do anything right, the computer's only going to give us back what we gave it. So we have to have a few tools in our arsenal to make sure that we're using high-quality data. And if we're not, then how do we deal with it? So one of the things that we know right away is unlike Sweden, I'm sure, unlike most European countries, we don't have a single source of truth for many of our providers. We don't have a common patient ID across the US. We have many, many, many IDs. And the Social Security number that we think of as a uniform ID for people in the US is really not a master patient index or any kind of ID. It's something that's used for employment, it's used for getting your retirement checks and things like that, but it's not really used as much as an identifier for healthcare, and we have to be a bit careful for that. And documentation is hit or miss. We have multiple places in EMR that we use for different things. Data entry errors happen all the time. We have a lot of 6-inch tall people at the Cleveland Clinic. It's not because it's a referral center for short people, but it's data entry errors, and we have to deal with those things, and we have to adjust for them in our system. We also don't have pharmacies that are all connected. So we have a very sparse look at over-the-counter medications. If I prescribe a patient aspirin, it's not always going to be there. But we can figure out what that error rate is and adjust for it in our systems. I'm not going to go through all this, but we know that if we are all asked questions in a website, how well we do with answering them. Some patients do better than others, but as we bring in patient-reported data from the patient portals into the electronic medical records, and as they come out from the electronic medical records into Explorus, we have to keep track of where that data came from. Because the patient-reported data in some cases may be better, in some cases may be worse than what the clinicians are recording in their systems. I'll give you an example here. These are, I'm not sure how well you can read these, but these are agreement rates between what the patient tells us in a portal and what we see when we look at their chart. And in some cases, they're more than 1% off on hemoglobin A1C. I don't mean a percentage variance. I'm talking about people saying that they have a hemoglobin A1C of 6% when it was really 7%. Well, that can make the difference between, that's a huge difference, a difference between compliance and non-compliance. Even as something as invasive as a proctoscopic examination, there's only an agreement. 22% of the people didn't remember getting an exam. Hard to believe, but it happens, and we have to be very careful with these types of data. We have supported a chronic kidney disease registry at the Cleveland Clinic using EMR data, and there's a number of publications in the nephrology journals, and I'll ask that you can pull up that journal and read more detail if you like. But when we did a study to validate the diagnoses that were in the EMR, you guys will always ask, how good is the data, right? So when we looked at different diagnoses, we found that for some diagnoses it was pretty good, and for some diagnoses it was less than good. So for example, if you take something like PKD, or polycystic kidney disease, it was pretty good, or diabetes. But if you look at hypertension, 65% sensitivity. That means there are people with hypertension where the system is not documenting that they have it. What does that mean? Well, it's possible that I might see a patient, and I don't want to raise their insurance rates, right? I don't want them to get a higher premium, so I may not document that they have high blood pressure just yet. I might wait a little while, maybe longer than I should wait. And that's going to be missed now if you just use coded diagnoses. The traditional way for looking for diagnoses is administrative data, right? You look at ICD-9 codes, CPT codes, you look for procedure codes, and then you try to exclude things that shouldn't be in there. That's the traditional way, and it's fraught with problems, just as I mentioned earlier. Another way that you can do this is a very nice study that was looking for recruiting patients for a genomic study, where they added subsequent criteria. And in protocols, we obviously do that already. We layer on successive criteria. But just by layering on a requirement that the patient not only be diabetic, but they have a hemoglobin A1C reading that's at a certain level, or that they require a certain medication can significantly increases our chances of finding those patients that we need. We may miss a few, but at least we'll be more certain that when we call up a patient to recruit them for a diabetes study, that they truly have diabetes, and that they're not a false positive because someone coded them incorrectly. Now, the other question I get asked is, okay, fine, why are you asking me to use a research EMR database? I can do everything by hand, and I can have this research database or this quality registry. But how good are these things? When there was a couple studies done, they looked at the error rates, and I'm sure you guys all have numbers on your databases when you reviewed them, but they're not that great either. The error rates are pretty profound, and I think we don't know what the gold standard is in most cases. But when we look at the traditional databases, even with double entry, there's still a certain level of error. So before we dismiss the EMR data as being not good enough, the question we should be asking ourselves, what is good enough? And what is the alternative? Now, Explorer's Population Explorer, which I'll show you in a few minutes, has been used by our customers, and when I say customers, I mean life science now, as a ad hoc population cohort exploration tool, and to identify people who might meet criteria for a clinical trial, connect to the provider organization, and say, can you call these patients up and invite them for a trial? You can also search across millions of patients. Again, I'm not going to go through all this now, because I'm going to show you. Our clinical research cycle is no different than what you guys think about. We have our research hypotheses tools. We can help develop protocols, help assess protocols in conjunction with a life science partner. We can help identify sites, assuming that the folks in our provider network are providers that you would want to work with. And we can identify potential investigators, and then help collect the data that's required, and then create a data set that can then be analyzed. Things that we've done for our provider organizations, and these are initiated by our provider organizations. We at Explorers do not go out and directly deal with an IRB. We will tell them how to explain what Explorers does to the IRB, because the logical question comes up, how can you do this? How can you bring in data from all these patients? How can you do it in a safe way? How can you comply with HIPAA, which is our US privacy policies? How can you comply with a newer form of HIPAA, HIPAA 2.0, which just came out, which is even more stringent? How do you do this, and what safeguards do you have in place? So we give that language to the IRBs, and then they will ask us questions if they have any. But we have facilitated e-recruitment and EHR data collection to, in many ways, and to a significant degree. It's been very successful in some areas and not so successful in other areas where, if you're looking for a needle in the haystack, this is the way to go. But if you're looking for something that every patient that walks through the door has, you don't need a service like this. You need a process in place, not a technology. Here's an example of a potential research study in which this is something that we get all the time, something like this, right? You're given a series of inclusion criteria. The patient has to have a certain type of diabetes. They have to have a certain demographic, and they either have to be treatment naive, or they have to be on a certain drug, or on a group of drugs. And by the way, they can't have any of the following things, because the FDA is going to require some. The investigators and the subject matter experts may also want to exclude certain people based on safety issues. So there's going to be a history of those things, and a list of criteria that are going to need to be modeled in any kind of environment to, number one, determine, is it feasible? Do patients like this even exist? And if they exist, where do they exist? And if they do exist, how do I go out and reach out to them? And if I want to reach out to them, do they have a series of providers or a couple providers that I can go after? And what we try to do is we try to provide a summary of all those things. If we model out each of the criteria, this is just a graphic here, but imagine down the side of the page, you would have all the inclusion criteria and the exclusion criteria. And now you try to model it out, you can actually put real numbers behind the scenes in terms of what the impact really is over time and over those criteria. And you can do this for every site. You can do it for a certain demographic. You can do it for a certain set of providers. We know that there's a big problem with clinical trials, at least in the non-cancer space in the US. So in cancer, at least, it's almost a standard of care to offer patients a clinical protocol. It's almost a standard. But in non-cancer, it's not. And it's still very difficult for primary care doctors to manage and keep track of all the different clinical trials that are going on. And we know that they want to participate. Most of the time, physicians in the US, they really, really do want to be participants in the clinical trial system. But they can't manage and keep track of all the trials. They may not have any direct benefit from participating. And in some places, it may not be something which is their core strength. Patients also are seeking out care in situations where they want to participate in trials. If a patient comes to the Cleveland Clinic, and they're coming from 5 or 6 states away, hundreds of miles away, they're not coming to the Cleveland Clinic just to see me. They're coming to Cleveland Clinic because they believe that the experts are going to offer them potential solutions or treatments that they can't get from their local physician, including clinical trials. So how do we put that information in front of the doctors? So we have worked at the Cleveland Clinic and with a few other partners with embedding the clinical trial information directly into the medical record. You guys have probably seen this a couple years ago when Martin Harris came So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we know it works. If you take a clinical trial like the Accord trial in the US a few years back, and you put an alert in the system, what you see is that you see a significant number of patients referred to the clinical trial coordinator. This is the white bar here. The enrollments, which is the black bar, you'll have to take my word for it or read the article. It is statistically significant rise in enrollments as well. So we generate a lot more interest in a trial by putting it in front of the physician. We also increase the number of people that actually get enrolled. And we've done this a number of times at the Cleveland Clinic. And the reasons why we might falsely identify a patient as being potentially eligible is all the reasons why that the patient may not qualify that are not structured and documented in EMR. One of the criteria might be, in the opinion of the investigator, likely to complete the trial. Well, what does that mean? You know, it's not hard, it's not that easy for an EMR to make that decision, but a person can. So those things can't be simulated, but we can certainly look at the impact of them. We did another trial that I was involved with around the H1N1 vaccine. We did with one of the sponsors. And what we tried to do was, we said, if you have a registry, a volunteer registry, of people interested in participating in a clinical trial. This was the Severe Asthma Research Program registry. These are volunteers. These are people that said, yes, call me. Call me if there's a trial going on. And we compared them to our tools on the research side and said, look, if you identify patients on the eResearch Explorer side of things, and we compare them to people in this volunteer registry, what happens? Here's what happened. We found that if we use the ER-based approach, we got 93 patients out of 540. 93 enrolled out of the 540 that were screened. So 17.2% versus the 24 out of 109. So a little bit higher screening rate failure, right? But look at the number of patients, 93 versus 24. And this is a volunteer registry. And these two numbers are not that different. So we really accelerated the amount of patients that could be brought in. But more importantly, as the FDA and other agencies get more stringent about the diversity of who you're bringing into trials, we increase the diversity. And the reason is because the EHR is blind to race and ethnicity and gender. It's just going to tell you that a patient's eligible or not. And patients in a volunteer registry in the US, there's a skew. There are more women and there are more Caucasians. That's just the reality of it. And again, not just Cleveland Clinic experience. If you look at University of Pittsburgh, they found something very similar. They used a coordinator in the waiting room versus an EHR alert, and they found the same thing, improved diversity and improved results. So let me go through and show you what Explorus does. And let me just go back for 1 second here. These are some screenshots in case we have trouble with the demo. And what it does is it basically provides you a graphical interface to be able to analyze and look at your cohorts that you identify. Now, one of the other things that we want to do is think about what would make this even more incredible for life science and more incredible for our providers. So one of the things that we alluded to was the fact that there's a payment reform model going on in the US. Payment reform models are going to require a huge amount of data that's going to be important for us, because it's not just about, did the drug work? Did the drug or device work in an economically advantageous way? And did it work better than another drug? Or did it work in a much more patient outcome? Were they better? Was the quality of life better? Was patient satisfaction better? All those are pieces of data that we don't really have from most US healthcare providers, but because of the pressure they're under around healthcare reform, there's going to be more and more of that data. So the way that we look at it at Explorus, in terms of, we use the National Quality Forums integrated measurement framework. We have and think about it from a life science point of view, it's the population that we're focused on. It's what happens in the beginning of that population that's important from our baseline characteristics and our outcomes point of view, and then what happens afterward. And how does that care get coordinated? Because somewhere in between one of these things, you want to intervene very early, whether it's a clinical trial or whether it's a retrospective analysis to see, did something make a difference? You know, just to give you a list of all the different things that are going on in the US, these are all demonstrations or experiments in terms of reshaping payment reform. So whether you're going to get paid for a bundle, you get paid when, like a shared savings, you do everything you're supposed to, and if the insurance company saves a little money at the end of the day, they'll give the provider a small piece of it, or it's all risk. You're going to get paid the same amount for every patient, and you got to make that dollar stretch as far as you can for that particular patient's needs. So at the end of the day, that data is going to be very helpful for the research community because it's all going to be structured. It's all going to follow the same rules that the federal government is requiring. It's all going to be available for searching and for indexing. It's going to be available to use it as a criteria for a clinical trial because it's going to be something that you can say patients who were given the best possible care, identify them, and now introduce them into a clinical trial. Because one of the arguments that I hear from sponsors all the time is, you know, Anil, can you ensure that the docs that are managing these patients were following the best protocols, care protocols? Because at the end of the day, we don't want that to be a reason why the drug didn't work, or that the device didn't work, or that diagnostic therapy didn't work. And that's going to be an important piece of it. And also, can you tell me how much did it cost for that cohort of patients who were on this drug versus not? Or were there fragmented care in this scenario? Did these patients on this drug go seek care elsewhere, and therefore not privy or in the purview of the principal investigator who might be at the hospital or who might be at an academic organization? What happens to them in the community is often lost. Now, here's our current partners. We have Cleveland Clinic, of course. It's 9 hospitals, 3.5 million patients. University Hospitals is a competitor to the Cleveland Clinic within Cleveland, yet they decided to join our network. And they're basically a couple academic hospitals and a very large group of community hospitals, community practices. Queens Hospital in Hawaii, Catholic Health Partners in Cincinnati, St. Joseph Hospital System in California, Texas, and New Mexico, which is in the southwest US. MedStar Health, a large 11-12 hospital system, Washington, D.C., Maryland, Baltimore area. Summa Health System in Ohio, and Metro Health, a safety net, a government hospital in Ohio. So it doesn't matter to us whether you're a government hospital, a private hospital, a for-profit hospital, or a non-profit hospital. It doesn't matter if you have 1 hospital or 10 hospitals in your system. It doesn't matter if you have a community-based practice or not. We aggregate all that information and bring it together. This is an example of where our patients are located. Now, you might see some sparsity. We don't have a lot of clients in Idaho or Montana or places in the middle of the country. We have concentrated mainly in the Mid-Atlantic, Midwest, so Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, New York, Pennsylvania, that area, Florida, Texas, Southern California, Northern California to some extent. And that's where we are today. But if I showed you this map a year ago, all you would have seen is this. So we're growing very, very quickly. Our intent is to have this map mirror the density map of the US population so that we have a significant representation of that. But also to go beyond the US and to think about what it means to bring our technology and our solutions to other places in the world. And let me wrap up with that slide. And I'm hoping to leave plenty of time for questions. Kai can tell us whether we have time for. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anil. I have a lot of questions on my list, but probably should give the room for some questions from the audience. I think it's definitely an interesting thinking that we as a healthcare organization switch from assuring that we store data to use data. And I guess you thought a lot about how to be a good service provider to these healthcare organizations, and how have you structured this so you can actually market it to the healthcare organizations, and how do you do that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kai. So one of the things that we wanted to do is to make sure that we didn't lose sight of the fact that the data is coming from the provider organizations. And they're not voluntarily giving it to us. They're giving it to us in exchange for a service. So one of the things that we marketed was 2 ideas. The first idea is that you have a lot of data in your systems that is being untapped, and you need something like Exploris or to bring it together and make it available for your clinicians. So the value add for them to be able to unlock the data that's sitting there and make it available for their clinicians and their investigators at their own organizations. And then we say, if you don't want to pay for this service, this is for the healthcare providers, if you don't want to pay for this service, we'll subsidize it. We'll give it to you for free. We'll put this appliance behind your firewall, make these tools available for you as an organization, and then we'll also make this same data in a de-identified way available for life science and for us to do analytics and et cetera. And so the providers have had a choice. They can either pay for this appliance and pay for the interface, the application that you saw. I only showed you a small glimpse of it. Or they can have it fully subsidized. All of our 10 integrated delivery systems, all the hospitals they encompass, said, sure, we'll take the free version and we'll allow our data to be de-identified and made available to life science. So that has not been a challenge. And then the question is, well, how do we market it to life science? How do we let people know what we have? So with life science, it's been a little bit different in the sense that we've gone to some of the meetings to explain what we do. We've partnered with some of the folks I used to work with when I was in e-research at the Cleveland Clinic. And we have explained that right now the traditional data sources that they have are often going to be limited. They're often going to not necessarily be as complete as an administrative plus clinically rich data set that we have. And we've gone through and made very, very clear product lines in what we do. So we have, for example, a description of protocol feasibility, a description for recruitment assistance. And then we tell life science, not only are you getting our service, but we can connect you to the provider organization where your patients are going to have to come from to recruit these subjects for a clinical trial. So we connect the dots. We connect the life science person who's looking for a service with the providers who can help them get the patients, but also if they're going to conduct that trial, they're going to conduct that trial somewhere, and that's going to be in the provider organization's community hospital, academic hospital, or in their practices. So it's a lot of it has been about connecting the provider and the investigator, or provider and the life science sponsor. A lot of it has been about articulating what it is that we can actually do, but we're still learning along the way as well. We've probably gone to 5 or 6 national meetings in the U.S. Talking about this, but most of the work that we've got has been by word of mouth. People that have used us and then said, you should go talk to this person and then see if there's any value for that person. So I'd like to say, Kai, that we're a well-oiled machinery where we have this perfect set of services detailed and all that. We're still in the stage where we're trying to further develop that, and our customers are helping us develop that message as much as we are.
Okay, I have one additional question then. That relates to us taking decisions within healthcare. More and more we need to or should rely on health economic evaluations. And of course then or the possibility to have quality of life measures as a part of your data is so crucial. And how frequent is that in your data set? Is it common, or is it just some hospitals working with these type of measures?
So, at least in the U.S., there's a couple different types of financial data that can be made available to us. The first lowest level common denominator is the claim that goes out from the hospitals and from the providers. It's what I as a provider or what I as a hospital say that I've done to the patient. And that data, almost every hospital partner has made available to us. The second is, how much did the insurance company or the federal government pay me for that service? That has been a little bit harder to come by. We've had a few hospitals that have shared that data with us. The third piece is, what is my charge master? What is my typical cost for these different services? That has also been something that most hospitals have not been willing to share with us. And there are some legal issues in making that available and making it transparent. And we're not asking for that information. What we're right now trying to do is making sure that we can at least measure utilization. How many x-rays did someone get? How many blood tests did someone get? What medication did someone get? Then apply a template across that to be able to say, this costs more than this. To me, it's not important as much about how much did a healthcare provider make on something. It's what did that happen, because ultimately we want to generalize that across a population. But to answer your question, Kai, we have different levels of detailed financial data coming from different providers. The common denominator, which is, what services did I provide? what did I utilize among the menu of things I could utilize? Almost every hospital is giving that information to us right now.
Okay, so let's see if we have any questions. I was also thinking about the personalized medicine aspect. Do you think that we already now should start preparing for this much better?
I believe so. I think patients are being inundated from the consumer side. As consumers, they're being presented, and I don't know how the laws are in Sweden, but in the US right now they're still trying to figure this out, where companies are, for-profit companies are willing to do genetic assays, in fact GWAS, genome-wide assays on patients, and present to them things that they could potentially be at risk for, and bringing reports to physicians and to their primary care providers, asking them if they are considering all these genetic markers when they're prescribing drugs or when they're looking at their overall health. Physicians are being inundated by this, they're being overwhelmed by this, but it's already happening at the consumer point. So most of the hospitals in the US and the clinicians are embracing personalized medicine and saying, if we don't start to tackle this, all these entrepreneurs are going to be doing it themselves, and then we're going to be on the receiving end. So even the Cleveland Clinic, they've started a genomics institute where they provide personalized medicine to their patients. And they're looking at ways of in fact, they're partnering with us to look at ways where we can help them with their data infrastructure, because again, I think this is going to be one of those things which is a big issue, is that if you can start doing these genomic analyses at a very low cost in a very short time, it's only a matter of time before we start doing it on every patient, especially in certain types of therapeutics where they're so costly and expensive that there may be a requirement to perform this prior to having someone reimburse a provider or a hospital for a very expensive treatment, because it may not necessarily work on every patient without the right kind of genetic markers. So we're beginning to see this in certain pockets in the US where personalized medicine for certain types of therapeutics is becoming required because of the significant costs associated with the treatment. But absolutely, I think we should start to prepare now. In the US already it's happening. It's just a matter of time. I think personalized medicine is going to change the way we look at therapeutics. It's going to be an alert that pops up in the medical records that says your patient is better off with a calcium channel blocker X, Y, and Z instead of this ACE inhibitor because of the following markers. So,
okay, thank you.
Elmira Movic, Gothenburg, Sweden. Thank you for a great presentation. I have just one comment. Outstanding. And I also would like to take this opportunity, and since I see our hospital director here, Jan, we got to get this. And a question. Now, obviously this system of yours can be used for many purposes, but how about research in terms of how active are US physicians to require the data to perform some kind of hypothesis generating studies? Are the system primarily used for pharmaceutical industry or others for some research in terms of their needs, or even in the healthcare system?
Right. It's being used by both healthcare providers. For example, our current healthcare providers are using it from everything from hypothesis generation. In some departments at the Cleveland Clinic is required to use Explorers before submitting a proposal, because you want to make sure you have the right number, or at least an acceptable number of patients before you go out and waste anyone's time in reviewing a proposal. It's required to use it at the Cleveland Clinic for any federal grant, and to put in pilot data and or numbers into the grant so that it increases your chances of getting that grant. It's being used on the clinical trial recruitment side at the Cleveland Clinic to identify, for example, about 6 months ago, in fact, my department at the Cleveland Clinic used it to recruit patients for an HIV clinical trial. And all their patients were identified using this technology, and they were able to limit the number of patients that they had to review in order to find those patients. There's a GI study where they use this to find people with irritable bowel syndrome. It's being used in other organizations besides the Cleveland Clinic. We recently had a phenomenal success with using it to do multi-site, multi-center studies where they were looking at the incidence of certain types of endocrine tumors, and the numbers were too small at one hospital, so they combined a series of hospitals in Northeast Ohio together using our tool to do a publication where they looked at the correlations. Life science is also utilizing this right now. So we've had engagements with 5 life science sponsors, big names that you guys will all recognize, and they've used it for a variety of things. They've used it for hypothesis generation on the study teams. They've used it to do some protocol tweaking. Where we've seen some challenges, and where we will hope that in 2013 we'll be able to give a much better solution, is on the epidemiology side and the health economics side, because they don't have the financial data yet. It's still growing, and we don't have a lot of built-in analytic tools. So we still need, we can't replace our need for SAS or for SPSS or for some of the analytic tools. So we can do hypothesis generation, we can do some protocol feasibility, but where life science partners have said to us, this is a great tool, we need more. We need you guys to focus on X, Y, and Z. Those areas that they've asked us to focus on and that we are focusing on is how do we make it more useful for the EPI folks, and how do we make it more useful for the HEOR folks.
This is getting more and more interesting. Now, you talked about patient safety, of course,
yes.
and of course, US has a problem with that, as I understood. Now, my field is interventional cardiology, and there's a lot of discussion about inappropriate use of NGOs and PCI.
Yep.
Could you use your system for finding out inappropriate applications of medication, devices, and so on, for patient safety and for health savings?
So it's a great question. There was a recent article I'm sure you're familiar with where there was a cardiologist at a hospital that essentially published a study showing that at their hospital they did too much angioplasty. That person no longer works at that hospital. So the answer right now has been we can, with the cooperation of the provider organizations. The way we get our provider organizations to share their data is a strict deal that we make with them, saying here are all the things that your data can be used for. And among one of those requirements is that before we use your data to do any kind of utilization or inappropriate utilization, we will come to you and ask you your permission, and we will never single you out as a hospital. So the short answer to your question is, yes, we can do that kind of stuff. We would do it in aggregate, not as individual hospitals. We would only do so with the cooperation of the provider organizations. Now, that doesn't stop Hospital A and Hospital B from doing their own sub-analyses. That is not stopped. But we will not proactively at Exploris start publishing data saying that there's overutilization of PCI or of a stent or of a, for example, one of the things that we've noticed is that there is some inappropriate use of certain medications in certain populations. Things that should be second line or third line are being used first line. We're not going to go out and publish that kind of data. It doesn't stop our provider organizations from using this to do that.
Okay, I will have room for one more question, and then I think we'll take the break.
Sir, I don't want to be a party pooper, but what if Exploris goes belly up? What happens then with the data? Who owns them?
I think if I understood your question correctly, you mentioned if Exploris goes out of business, who owns the data? Is that? Yeah. So your data, let's assume that you're a healthcare provider. The data that you submit is your data. And the little appliance that I had shown on the screen before, that completely de-identifies everything. So the data that's in the grid that's yours is your data. The piece that connects the data back to a identifier to identify a specific patient is your data. What is our data is any manipulation we've done with the data that you provided us. So if we've transformed the data from, let's say, you sent it to me as ICD-9 or ICD-10. Now I've transformed it as SNOMED. I've stripped away any patient identifiers. That's my data. So assuming I don't think we'll go bankrupt or that we'll be, I think a better way to put your question is what if we get bought out or we go public and someone acquires us, which will hopefully be a better thing for me. But if that happens and the data that's sitting in the grid that is identifiable that you've submitted is your data, period. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's how our contract's written. It's just the derivative data is ours.
Okay.
Does that answer your question? Sort of? Well, I'm more happy at the break to spend some more time on that.
Yes, I know Anil will stay with us for the full day, so please use Anil the possibility to place your question, because I think this is a great opportunity for us to learn how we actually can have this implemented, right? So thank you once again, Anil. And
thank you.
I think, hand over.
Thank you.